So 2 years ago, I was living in a van, and it wasn't a conscious, glamorous lifestyle choice that I decided to do. It was the result of me feeling very chaotic, anxious, torn between multiple different directions. And it was because my internal system had broken down that led me to this. My dopamine system was dysregulated, my thinking was chaotic, and my ability to focus was inconsistent. Basically, I'd lost control over my own behavior in a way that was deeply frustrating to me, especially given that I intentionally understood exactly what I should have been doing. So, from the outside, nothing about that situation made sense at the time. Looking back on it, it was completely chaotic time of my life. So, I was in medicine, I understood performance, I understood the theory, I knew how to train, recover, and structure my day, and yet I found myself that I wasn't actually executing on any of this consistently at that point. I would have short periods where everything aligned, where I was, training well, sleeping well, thinking clearly, and operating at a level I respected in myself. But those periods never seemed to last. One disruption would often cause, a cascade of problems. It was hard to maintain all of these good habits. I found this might be, one per night of sleep, a demanding stretch of shifts, or simply cognitive overload when I had a lot of tasks on my brain, not really aware of them, and just feeling overwhelmed. So this would destabilize everything, and I would fall back into the same pattern. That cycle seemed to repeat itself for longer than I'm comfortable admitting at the time. And during that time, I made the same mistake that most high-performing doctors make when they feel inconsistent. So in this video, I'm going to break down my own experience and tell you what was going on. Okay, so I assumed at that time the problem was discipline, and often that would get you very far. It's got me very far. It's got a lot of doctors very far. Just that hard work, that discipline, getting through medical school, becoming a doctor, etc. So that same mindset, that pushing harder, was the natural mindset that I had. I believed that if I could just become more controlled, more structured, more focused, then consistency would follow. So I increased my effort and tried to impose tighter routines, stricter expectations, and more rigid structure. But what I found was the more I tried to force this consistency, the more unstable my behaviors became. And that was the paradox, really, because inconsistency, particularly in high-functioning individuals, I find, is very rarely a reflection of low discipline. It's usually a reflection of a system that cannot withstand the variability of the environment it is operating in. So there's no real flexibility. And I really think, doctors especially, you need that level of flexibility to maintain these things. You need to not just be so hard on yourself, push yourself, especially on these times where you have these big runs of shifts, weekends, nights, etc. So medicine is one of the most variable environments that you can be in. So your sleep timing is inconsistent a lot of the time, which disrupts your circadian rhythm and downstream hormone regulation. Your cognitive demand fluctuates dramatically, which impacts your decision-making capacity and mental fatigue. So if you're using all of that reserve in the hospital, on your job, on the wards, then by the time you go home and want to actually implement your own habits, your routines outside of work, your willpower reserve is really depleted, and you just don't feel like doing it, and that's the big problem here. So your schedule also lacks predictability as well. That's a massive thing. So it removes the ability to rely just on fixed routines, doing the same thing in every day. There's a massive benefit to that. And often I get really jealous of like 9-to-5ers who have the same day, Monday to Friday, they have weekends, and that just repeats itself. Then you can just fall into this, this comfortable, constant pattern, which is almost like on autopilot. With being a doctor and the constantly changing shift, you can't really rely on this. So that's the problem. When you try to apply a rigid, stable structure to an inherently unstable system, failure is not just possible, it's inevitable. And that was the core problem that I experienced. I was trying to operate as if my environment was stable, when it really was anything but that. And once I understood that, the question changed. Instead of asking how to become more disciplined, I started asking how to build systems that remain functional under conditions of variability, fatigue, and cognitive load. So that shift in thinking is what allowed everything else to follow. The first principle I implemented was moving away from rigid routines and toward flexible systems. So from a neurological perspective, one of the main reasons people fall into inconsistency is because they operate in a all or nothing state of mind. Very common for doctors because often it attracts that perfectionist mindset. You know, the good students in school are more likely to become doctors, med school, high standards, and it's this perfectionism or all or nothing mindset. It can get us very far, but also it leaves us open to these vulnerabilities, this all or nothing mindset. So it's about adapting that. So instead of having one fixed version of a behavior, I introduce multiple tiers. So for example, with training, I structured it to have 3 levels: a full session for high energy states, or maybe days off where I have the time, I have the energy, but also a reduced session for moderate energy when maybe I don't have the time or I've just done a long shift, and then a minimum baseline for low energy or for low time where I'm just focusing on maintaining the habit, maintaining the momentum, not really trying to push and make these big gains, but it's more to just lock in that habit and momentum. This ensures that regardless of physiological state or whether I feel like it, I was able to adapt my behavior and still execute that habit. So what this does at a systems level is preserve behavioral continuation, which in the long term is far more important than intensity. And then the second principle was defining what the minimum viable behaviors are. These are the smallest actions that maintain neural and behavioral momentum even under suboptimal conditions. So from a habit formation perspective, consistency strengthens these neural pathways, whereas inconsistency weakens them, okay? So even small repeated actions reinforce the identity of someone who follows through, who is consistent. And for me, this looked like short walks, brief training sessions, basic nutritional structure, and simple recovery protocol. So things that are very easy to do even on my worst days. And yeah, I take a lot of this from what James Clear writes in his book Atomic Habits. You know, identity is stacked up over time through daily evidence saying that you're the type of person to do these things. So that's why it's very important, just from a identity point of view, to execute these things even when you don't feel like it, even when you don't have the time, don't have the energy. It's not about actually getting the results or the progress, it's about maintaining that sense of identity. So long term, you're going to stay consistent. So these actions were intentionally unimpressive, but they were repeatable, and repeatability is what allows a system to stabilize. So the third principle was reducing decision fatigue. After extended periods of cognitive demand on a busy shift, particularly in clinical environments at the hospital, the prefrontal cortex becomes less effective at making these decisions, once you've come home from work. And this increases the likelihood of defaulting to easier, lower effort behaviors like just sitting on the couch, watching TV, Netflix, scrolling on your phone, distracting yourself because you don't have the willpower, you don't have the energy. So rather than relying on willpower, which is completely, it's a limiting reserve, I removed as many decisions as possible. So meals were pre-planned, training was pre-decided, and recovery had structure. This effectively shifted behavior from something that required active decision making to something that occurred by default. So by making the easiest path of resistance lead to these good actions rather than the bad, distracting actions. So I made a conscious distinction between identity and execution. My schedule could vary, my energy could fluctuate, but my identity remained stable. And I was still someone who prioritized training, recovery, and structure. The behavior adapted to the environment, but the identity remained constant. That separation allowed this flexibility without losing direction. And the fifth principle here, and arguably the most important, was building structure around transitions. So most behavioral breakdown does not occur during stable periods. It occurs during transitions, such as after a long shift, before starting work, or during periods of fatigue. These are moments where the nervous system is either highly activated or completely depleted, and without intentional regulation, behavior becomes reactive rather than proactive. So I introduced specific transition protocols: a walk after shift to down-regulate the nervous system, a consistent wind-down routine to support sleep onset. Basically simple, repeatable anchors that create a rhythm within an otherwise unpredictable schedule. So it's about controlling the controllables and letting go of the things that you can't control. So over time, this reduced the variability of my internal state. But when I reflect on that period, living in a van, what stands out is not the environment itself, but the lack of internal structure that I had. Everything felt reactive. There was no rhythm, no stability, no control. And that is the state many doctors find themselves in, even if their external circumstances look very different. Because the external environment is not the primary issue, the absence of these systems is. Today, the environment is still demanding, shifts are still unpredictable, and cognitive load is still high, but internally everything operates differently because there is structure, because there is rhythm, and there are systems that are designed to function under pressure. And that is, for me, what creates consistency. Not perfection, not rigid routines, but systems that remain stable even when everything else in the environment and the external is not. So if you're a doctor that currently feels inconsistent with your routines and your habits, it's not whether you're disciplined enough. You've already proven that. That's definitely not going to be the problem, most likely. The question is whether your current system is capable of supporting the environment you're operating in, because if it is not, you will continually repeat this same cycle. Short-term structure followed by collapse, followed by reset. But if the system is built correctly, consistency becomes an output of the system rather than something you have to force. And once that happens, performance, even at work, becomes significantly easier to sustain, as well as outside of work. And if you want help building these systems and clarity on your current situation, then you can book a free call with me where we can get you that clarity. I'll see you on the next one.